Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine the scene. India, freshly independent, buzzing with this incredible achievement of throwing off colonial rule.
Yeah, and establishing a democracy, a robust one.
Exactly. But right alongside those triumphs sat this monumental, maybe even tougher challenge.
Mhm.
How do you lift an entire nation out of poverty? How do you ensure economic well-being for everyone?
It's huge. And the path chosen by India's early leaders, well, it wasn't simple. It was complex, often difficult.
And you could argue maybe saw more limited initial success compared to, say, building the nation state itself or embedding democracy.
Absolutely. And I think that's because this wasn't just an economic equation, you see.
Right.
Figuring out how to develop, which paths to take, whose needs get prioritized. These are fundamentally political choices.
Involving debates about values, power, competing interests.
Totally. It's all tangled up.
Precisely. And that dynamic interplay between politics and economics is really what this deep dive is all about today. We're exploring those political choices baked into the key questions of economic development during India's first couple of decades after independence.
Yeah. Our mission really is to understand the core debates, the options they faced, why a specific strategy was adopted in those crucial first 20 years.
What it actually achieved.
What it achieved, exactly, and where it fell short. And importantly, why that strategy eventually ran into pretty significant challenges later on.
And understanding this isn't just like an academic exercise, is it?
Not at all.
It shows us that these huge questions about what development even, is it massive dams and steel mills? Or is it empowering rural communities?
Or something else entirely.
Right. Is it tight government control or letting private enterprise lead? These are always inherently political battles.
Always. They're about balancing conflicting interests, and those conflicts, they often play out in very real, very human ways.
You see this so clearly in that Orissa example you mentioned from the material.
Oh, absolutely. You've got these vast iron ore reserves there, right? And with global demand for steel just soaring at the time, it looks like a golden opportunity for investment.
Naturally. The state government is understandably eager to bring in capital, create jobs.
Signing agreements, mount choose with big companies.
But then, boom.
Yeah.
Immediately you have these powerful clashes of interest.
That's it. A lot of that iron ore is in areas inhabited by tribal communities.
And they look at these huge projects and just see this terrifying prospect of displacement, right? Losing their homes, their livelihoods.
Their whole way of life, potentially.
And alongside that, you've got the environmental concern.
Big ones. Fears about pollution from mining, from heavy industry impacting land, water, air. It's unavoidable.
Meanwhile, the central government is trying to navigate its own set of, fears and objectives.
Yeah, they're worried that if they block these investments because of local opposition or environmental issues.
This sends a bad signal.
Exactly. A signal that India isn't open for business. It could discourage crucial investment across the whole country.
It's a real balancing act.
What's fascinating here, as the material highlights, is that you can bring in all the technical experts you want. Geologists, engineers, economists, environmental scientists.
And you should. Their input is vital.
Of course. But ultimately, the decision isn't really a technical one. It's about weighing these fundamentally different interests.
Different social groups, the present versus the future.
Exactly. And in a democracy, those big values-laden decisions, they really need to be made by representatives who are, connected to the people they serve.
Yeah, the experts can tell you the options, maybe the likely consequences, but only the political process can really decide which consequences are acceptable and maybe whose interests ultimately prevail.
And that real-world fight, like that news snippet about villagers protesting the PO soda plant back in 2006.
Right, that underscores it.
It wasn't just happening in policy papers. It was a boots-on-the-ground conflict over profoundly different ideas of progress and who gets to define it.
And navigating that kind of conflict, making those tough political choices, that's a fundamental part of India's post-independence political story.
Absolutely central.
So, if the very idea of development sparks such deep divisions, from that tribal community in Orissa to the steel magnate, how did independent India even begin to chart a course?
Well, it's true. That Orissa example perfectly illustrates that development is never a single universally agreed upon concept. It just isn't.
Different things to different people.
Exactly. An industrialist building a steel plant sees it one-way jobs, growth, maybe profit.
An urban consumer wants affordable steel for construction, cars.
Sure. And an Adivasi living in the forest sees it as well, a threat to their existence. These fundamentally different perspectives are pretty much guaranteed to create contradictions, debates.
And looking back at that period right after independence, there was this powerful, almost default tendency to view the West, Europe, the U.S., as the standard bearer.
Yes, the standard for what modern and developed looked like. It was a really widespread framework, shared by many globally at the time.
The idea being societies progressed along a similar path.
Kind of a linear path, yeah. Moving from traditional to modern through industrialization, urbanization, shedding old customs.
Embracing capitalism, liberalism, scientific rationality.
All of that. And within this view, countries could be sort of neatly placed on a spectrum, developed, developing, or underdeveloped.
So India looked out at the world stage and saw, broadly, two major models of modern development being actively pursued.
That's right. You had the liberal capitalist model of the West and then the centrally planned socialist model of the USSR.
And it's a really interesting historical point, isn't it? That, well, you might expect capitalist development to be the default.
Right.
The Soviet model actually deeply impressed a large number of Indian leaders, Nehru himself included.
Yes, very much so. And this wasn't just confined to the explicitly communist or socialist parties. It held significant sway within the national movement, within the early Congress government.
And the American-style capitalist path.
Surprisingly few vocal advocates in India initially. Really quite limited support back then.
But despite those different global models, there was this very strong consensus forged during the independence movement itself, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Everyone agreed. The government of Free India had to play a completely different role, a much more active role than the old colonial government.
The colonial state was primarily extractive, right? Taking things out.
Exactly. The post-independence government, the census was, had a primary responsibility for tackling poverty, for pursuing social and economic redistribution.
You know, ensuring a more equitable distribution of wealth, opportunity.
That was the core idea.
But within that consensus for strong government action, there were still huge debates, surely.
Oh, massive debates. Where should the focus be? Rapid industrialization?
Or maybe tackling rural poverty and agriculture first.
Exactly. What exactly should the government do? Just plan things? Or should it also own and run key industries?
And how do you balance that fundamental need for social justice with the drive for economic growth? They can sometimes seem at odds.
That was the crux of it. These were the critical points of disagreement, of political contestation that really shaped policy.
And when we talk about that political contestation in this era, the terms left and right become kind of relevant shorthand, don't they?
They do, yeah. In this specific Indian context, the left generally represented those advocating for the poor, the marginalized.
Supporting significant government intervention in the economy.
Right. Pushing for policies aimed at economic redistribution.
While the right tended to argue more for, well, free markets.
Free markets, competition, less government interference in the economy as the best way to achieve overall progress. Those were roughly the poles of the debate.
Okay, so with all these competing ideas, global influences, internal debates swirling around,
Yeah.
how did they actually land on a concrete strategy? How would the government actually drive development?
Well, despite all those debates about the details of government intervention, there was this remarkably strong consensus across quite a wide spectrum of political opinion
What?
on one fundamental point. Development could not be left solely to private businesses. It just couldn't. The government had to actively design and steer the process. They needed a plan.
And here's where you find that really surprising historical detail.
Yeah.
You'd perhaps expect private industrialists, the big business houses, to be the last people wanting state planning.
That's the fascinating insight. As the material points out, even a section of big industrialists got together back in 1944 before independence.
Really?
Yeah, and drafted something called the Bombay Plan. It was their own proposal for a planned economy.
Wow.
And it explicitly called for the state to take major initiatives in industrial and other key investments. So it wasn't just a left idea, it had this surprising broader support.
So the idea of planning wasn't some alien concept just imposed after independence. It had roots in these pre-independence discussions. It had gained widespread legitimacy.
Exactly. And it wasn't just an Indian thing either. Planning was incredibly popular globally in the 1940s and 50s.
Why was that?
Well, think about it. Governments had successfully mobilized resources during World War II, right? Countries were rebuilding after the war using planned approaches.
Okay.
And crucially, the Soviet Union seemed to be achieving pretty spectacular growth rates through its central planning model in the decades leading up to this. So the whole global intellectual climate strongly favored planning at that time.
And that's where the Planning Commission comes in.
Yeah.
It becomes the central body for this whole approach.
It does. Though it's interesting, it wasn't actually created by the Constitution itself.
Well,
no, it was set up by a simple government resolution in March 1950. Its role was formally advisory. Its recommendations only became actual policy if the Union Cabinet approved them.
But it quickly became incredibly powerful, influential in setting the direction.
Hugely influential. And the resolution that set it up directly tied its mandate to those high-level objectives laid out in the directive principles of state policy in the Constitution.
So things like
promoting welfare and justice, social, economic, political, ensuring adequate livelihoods for everyone, making sure resources were distributed for the common good.
and preventing wealth concentration.
Yeah, preventing the concentration of wealth and economic power that could harm the broader community. These were big, ambitious goals handed to the Planning Commission.
And the main tool they adopted to achieve these goals famously borrowed from the Soviet model, the 5-year plan.
The 5-year plan, yes.
Cool.
It's a relatively straightforward concept, actually.
How did it work?
The government would create this comprehensive document outlining its planned income and expenditure for the next 5 years. The overall budget was kind of divided.
Into 2 parts.
Exactly. Non-plan for the routine stuff, recurring yearly expenses, and plan for the new initiatives, the investment priorities identified for that 5-year period.
And the big perceived advantage was
That it forced the government to think beyond just the next budget cycle, right? To focus on long-term strategy, allowing for major sustained interventions in the economy.
all right, looking at the bigger picture.
The launch of the very first 5-year plan document in 1951 generated enormous excitement across the country. It was really widely discussed, debated.
And that enthusiasm really peaked with the second 5-year plan, didn't it?
It did, yeah, the one that came out in 1956. And that carried some momentum into the third plan in 61.
But then things started to change.
Yeah, as the challenges started accumulating, the novelty, that initial buzz, had definitely worn off by the time the fourth plan was due in 1966.
Which was a year India faced a major economic crisis.
Precisely. Which ultimately led to what's often called a plan holiday. A pause.
But it's important to remember, as the material points out, that despite the criticisms and the challenges that emerged, the foundational structure for India's future economic development was, by that point, pretty firmly established.
Yes, the groundwork was laid.
So let's look at those crucial first 2 plans then, because they really represent slightly different visions or priorities, don't they?
They do.
The first 5-year plan, 1951 to 1956. Where did they start? What was the main goal?
The absolute primary goal was, simply put, to lift the country out of that basic cycle of poverty and stagnation. Just get things moving.
And there was a philosophy guiding it, famously described by the economist K.N. Raj as hasten slowly.
Hasten slowly, yes. The idea was that moving too fast, disrupting things too much, might actually put India's fragile new democracy at risk. So patience was seen as key.
Okay, so a cautious approach.
Given that, the main focus was logically the agrarian sector. Agriculture was the backbone of the economy, and it had been severely disrupted by partition just a few years earlier.
So lots of investment in.
Big investments in things like dams and irrigation projects. Iconic projects like the Bakra Nangal Dam came out of this period, nation-building stuff.
And the plan also zeroed in on land distribution patterns, didn't it?
Yes, identifying them as a major barrier to both productivity and social justice. That led to a strong focus on land reforms, trying to redistribute land more equitably.
And from an economic perspective, what was the core challenge?
A core challenge was increasing national income, which really requires boosting domestic savings. People need to save more so that money can be invested.
But how do you save when people are barely earning enough to meet basic needs?
Exactly. That's the bind. It was hoped savings would rise, and while there was an initial uptick, it wasn't spectacular. And actually, savings started dropping consistently from the early 1960s onwards, which definitely posed problems down the line.
Okay, then came the second 5-year plan in 1956. And this one had a very different feel, a much more ambitious thrust.
Totally different. Heavy industries, that was the big shift.
Drafted by a team led by P.C. Mahalanobis, the statistician.
Yes, a brilliant mind. And if the first plan was about hastening slowly, the second was really about pushing for rapid structural transformation. Essentially, trying to fundamentally shift India from being primarily an agrarian economy towards becoming an industrial one, relatively quickly, making simultaneous changes across key sectors, a big push.
And this plan also had clear political backing.
Oh, yes. It reflected the Congress Party's stated goal, declared a couple of years earlier at their Avadi session, of building a socialist pattern of society. The plan aligned with that political vision.
So what were some of the key policies?
Well, implementing substantial tariffs on imports was a big one.
To protect domestic industries.
Exactly. Making imported goods more expensive, thereby protecting and encouraging Indian industries, both the emerging public sector and private businesses, to grow and fill the gap.
And investment.
With savings and investment showing some growth at this point, the government invested heavily in key public sector areas: electricity generation, railways, steel plants, heavy machinery, communication infrastructure.
So this drive towards industrialization under the second plan is really considered a major turning point.
Absolutely. A defining moment in India's early development path.
And the third plan, which followed.
It didn't represent a major departure from the second, really continued that heavy industry focus.
But as they continued down this path, problems definitely started to emerge, become more pronounced.
Yes, inevitably. India was still, technologically quite backward compared to the advanced industrial nations.
What you mean?
Building those heavy industries required importing expensive machinery, technology, know-how.
They're costing valuable foreign exchange.
Which was always scarce. And there was this growing concern that because industry was getting so much investment priority, especially under the second and third plans,
agriculture might suffer.
Exactly. It could lead to food shortages if agricultural growth didn't keep pace. Balancing these two vital sectors, industry and agriculture, proved incredibly difficult for the planners.
And criticisms started mounting.
They did. Criticisms of the second and third plans grew louder. There were accusations of an urban bias.
Meaning policies seemed to favor industrial areas, cities, over the vast rural countryside where most people lived.
Precisely. And there was also a more fundamental debate about whether industry should have been prioritized over agriculture at all in the first place.
Or maybe focus on different types of industries.
Right. Perhaps industries more directly linked to supporting agriculture or maybe meeting immediate consumer needs rather than these massive, long gestation, heavy industry projects.
So these accumulating economic and structural problems may be combined with external shocks like wars or droughts.
Really came to a head. They contributed significantly to the economic crisis India faced around 1966.
And that crisis ultimately forced the government to declare that plan holiday we mentioned.
Yes, marking a point where that initial almost boundless optimism and widespread belief in the planning model really began to fade quite significantly.
It's also worth thinking about that fascinating tension highlighted by someone like Francine Frankel looking back at this era.
Yes, her observation about a potential contradiction running right through the early Congress approach. It's quite insightful.
On one hand.
On one hand, the National Party leadership officially endorsed socialist principles, believing in state ownership, strong regulation, government control over key sectors.
To boost productivity, prevent wealth concentration.
Right. But simultaneously, the same Congress government was actively pursuing more liberal economic policies, offering incentives designed to encourage private investment.
And the justification for that was simply maximizing overall production.
Pretty much. It suggests the political landscape wasn't a simple case of choosing between two clear opposing ideologies.
More complex.
Much more. They were often trying to pursue what might look like contradictory goals at the same time, reflecting the complex pressures and competing interests they were trying to balance from the very beginning.
So looking back now, after that initial big push and the challenges that led to the plan holiday, what's the overall picture? What was achieved, what wasn't?
Well, despite all the problems, all the criticisms, the material does note that the foundation for India's future economic development was firmly laid during this period.
Okay.
That ambitious push, particularly in the second plan, it did succeed in building key public sector industries, creating essential infrastructure, fostering an industrial base that simply hadn't existed before.
And there was that initial rise in domestic savings.
Yes, even if it didn't meet the high targets and, crucially, later declined, it was there initially.
But the limitations are equally clear, aren't they?
Absolutely. The ongoing struggle to balance investment between industry and agriculture, the persistent foreign exchange difficulties, the validity of criticisms like urban bias.
And ultimately, the economic pressures that forced that pause in the planning process.
Exactly. And if we circle back to our initial questions, we've seen the core choices, the debates, the rationale for adopting planning,
The specifics of the strategies in those first two plans.
their achievements, and their undeniable limitations. The complex question of why this specific planning strategy was eventually modified or even partially abandoned in later decades, well, it's deeply tied to these accumulating challenges and the ongoing debates that started right back in the very first years.
So what does diving into this history tell us about India today? Or maybe even development more globally?
I think it tells us that the fundamental debates from this period, about the proper role of the state versus the market, how to balance industrial growth with agricultural needs, how to achieve growth while ensuring social justice, these are far from settled history.
Still relevant.
Hugely relevant. These questions continue to shape policy discussions about development everywhere, including, of course, in India today. Understanding this early attempt at planned development gives us a really crucial historical lens through which to view current debates.
It really does. And it leaves you with something quite significant to ponder, doesn't it? Thinking back to that Orissa example, with its multiple legitimate interests clashing, and considering that observation about leaders sometimes trying to pursue potentially contradictory goals simultaneously, how can any democracy truly navigate these development decisions? Decisions which inherently involve conflicts of interest.
Yeah.
How do you genuinely ensure that development serves the needs of all its people? And who, at the end of the day, really holds the power to define what those needs are and make the final call?
It's the perennial question, isn't it? It was central in those early years, and it remains incredibly relevant, incredibly challenging today.